Grace and peace to you in the name of God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. Well, here we are. We've arrived at the heart of Leviticus. The heart, we might say, of our relationship with God. We've arrived at the Holiness Code. You might remember a few weeks ago when we talked about sacrifices in response to sin, I mentioned chapter 18. I talked about how we often get tripped up by Leviticus because we assume we know what it has to say on the subject of sin, and so we either skip right over it or we pull out specific verses and either argue with them or clobber people with them depending on our perspective. I pointed out that this is a problematic practice because we shouldn't make a habit of reading any of the Bible out of context, particularly the parts we don't agree with. And so it may have been surprising to you this morning to realize that we're actually skipping most of chapter 18 in our reading. Yes, verses 6 through 23 provide some much needed context for what is often incorrectly interpreted as a Levitical ban on homosexuality, widening the lens to cover activity between a range of partners. But what that context makes clear is that Leviticus 18 isn't talking about healthy, life-giving, intimate relationships. It's talking about anything but. While healthy, life-giving, intimate relationships are important for us to talk about in the church, I'm not sure that those verses are the best ones to steer us towards that conversation, nor is that the point of those verses or these chapters of Leviticus. Instead, in chapters 18 and 19, and chapter 20, which we will explore next week, God is focused on calling the people to become holy. The book of Leviticus is a call to worship, a call to community, to a way of life. And the anchor, the heart of that entire book is found in our reading for today. Become holy, for I, your God, am holy. But this verse, or this half verse, sits in the middle of these three chapters, which are often called the Holiness Code in Leviticus. Just like we shouldn't read any other verse in the Bible out of context, we need to consider the context in which we find this statement as well. Chapter 18 begins with a mention of Egypt behind them and Canaan before them. Where is Israel on their journey? They left Egypt months earlier after centuries in slavery there, and now they're camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. They've received the commandments from God, and they've built the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle, and they're gathered at the tent of meeting where God's presence, God's holiness is so massive that Moses literally won't fit into the tent with God. And everything God has instructed Moses to tell the people about maintaining relationships within the community and with God and restoring those relationships when they get out of balance by atoning for harms that are caused either intentionally or unintentionally and working towards the holiness to which God calls them. They've come from somewhere and they're headed to somewhere. And God recognizes that both represent a danger. Both represent a test, a temptation in their desire to become holy as God is holy. But God promises that becoming holy is the way that leads to life. All other ways point inexorably to exile and death. They were enslaved in Egypt, but in the wilderness they complained of hunger and thirst, begging to be allowed to go back to another way of living that may have seemed easier in retrospect. And they're going to Canaan, a land to which they will have to conquer, where there will be temptations to adopt other gods, other ways of living that may look easy and free. Here at the foot of Mount Sinai and on their 40-year journey, they are in the in-between, in a way of life that may feel more like just existing than like any kind of a life at all. We're in a different sort of in-between right now, but an in-between time all the same. What lies behind us? Do we look at the relative economic stability of the last few years, or do we look before that, to before COVID turned the world upside down? Or do we look before that? Somehow that particular goalpost keeps shifting, and the good old days that we think we remember somehow weren't really as good as we want to remember them. And what lies ahead of us? If the temptation for the Israelites to assimilate will lead them to Baal worship and the threat of the Babylonian exile, where does our path lead? My fear, friends, is that we are walking a very treacherous path indeed. On the one hand, assimilation with the empire will lead us to Christian nationalism, closer and closer to the fascist regime that seems to be looming impossibly large on the horizon. On the other hand, if we remain steadfast, if we put our hope in nothing but the grace that will be given us when Jesus Christ is revealed, instead being holy in everything we do, since it is the Holy One who has called us, as Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 and 15. If we lean into the holiness that God calls us to, I am afraid that we are headed for very bleak times. Times when it seems that death will have the last word after all. But God promises us that life is built into the very statutes that we are given. Think about the 10 Commandments, the law given by God to Moses to pass on to the people on that very spot where they still stand in this morning's text. How do they start? I am your God. Don't put anyone else first. Don't make any idols, and don't misuse my name. Keep the Sabbath holy. Honor your parents. And then on from there. I am your God becomes the refrain of the Holiness Code. It's used 26 times in chapters 18 through 20. It's not a commandment. It becomes the punctuation to the people's lives, the period at the end of every sentence, the reason for everything they do, the reason for everything we do. If we want to become holy, it's only because of this. I am your God. No one else and nothing else is our God. But from there, God turns the commandments on their heads. What do we need to do if we want to become holy? First, we must care for our parents and the elders in our community who have raised and taught us. Then we must keep the Sabbath, setting aside that day as a day to honor God and ensure that everyone in our communities has a day of rest. And then we must not worship anything else in God's place. This is the perspective of the Holiness Code. How we live with each other is at least as important as our faithfulness to God. And the pattern in these verses is just as important as the perspective. First, the ones we are closest to, then the well-being offering, the first and the best we offer of ourselves to God, and then our neighbors, including the most vulnerable in our communities. But this isn't a ranking system, as some have implied recently. This is a recentering of our call to holiness on those who need us the most, the ones among us who are in jeopardy. When that ranking system, which is really a function of Christian nationalism, a function of the empire, gives preferential treatment to the ones who are already privileged. When it implies that ethics and empathy are, at best, optional, or at worst, a sign of weakness rather than a demonstration of what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves. Because that's a hard thing to do. I won't ask for a show of hands, but in our gospel reading for today, I wonder how many of you made some sort of a judgment call about who was better, the Pharisee or the tax collector. But here's the thing, as far as the rules are concerned, the Pharisee's doing exactly what he's supposed to do and then some. If there's a letter of the law, he's dotting the I's and crossing the T's and even adding all of the accent marks in all the right places. And we don't have any idea if the tax collector is doing any of that at all. But what the Pharisee is not doing is loving his neighbor as himself. I'll confess my own initial bias when I read our gospel reading for today. I totally judged the Pharisee. I thought, wow, I'm so much better than that guy. I'm not nearly as judgmental as he is. Ironic, right? It's so easy to compare ourselves to someone else, either positively, as the Pharisee does, or negatively. And from there, it can be a very slippery slope. If we think we're better, it can be entirely too easy to decide that they don't deserve our compassion, or that it's okay to pull a fast one over on them, or to laugh at their misfortune. Or, if we compare ourselves unfavorably, it can be easy to hold on to a grudge, to let it simmer until it explodes. But either way, whether we consciously choose assimilation or whether we find ourselves slipping into the comparison game, we fall into the trap of not loving our neighbor as ourselves. But we are all, every single one of us, made in the image of God. We are all, every single one of us, called to become holy. It's a high bar, but it's worth striving for, especially when we are in the in-between. Amen.